Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Robb. I'm a recent graduate from the master's program at Ontario Tech University's Faculty of Education, and I currently work as the research and project manager in Dr. Janette Hughes' STEAM 3D Maker Lab. Today, I have the pleasure of having a conversation with Dr. Hughes on all things making. So, hi, Dr. Hughes. Can you tell us a little bit about your research and how you got started with making and research into making?
Yeah, I'm a Canada Research Chair in Technology and Pedagogy in the Faculty of Education at Ontario Tech. I'm also an avid maker, and I think that we're all makers. In my spare time, I'm a stained glass artist, and you can see my bench and some of my work behind me here. This is my maker space. But I also make gardens and I knit, so it's very natural for me to want to explore this area. I've been doing research in the area since I began my PhD, which was in 2003. I've always been particularly interested in production pedagogies and the ways that students of all ages learn through creating something, whether that something is a digital poem or a dramatic performance or a video, or even a few lines of code. And as a former high school drama and English teacher, my emphasis was always on the process and what students could learn through that creative process. For the last 5 years, I've been doing research related to the maker movement and the biological, cognitive, and socio-emotional benefits of making. My research team and I have worked with hundreds of teachers across Ontario, as well as their students and teachers in places like Brazil and Bermuda. So our research also has an outreach and an in-reach component. And by that, I mean that we go out to schools, but we also invite teachers and their students into the lab. So when we do go into teachers' classrooms, we prefer to go physically, but for the most part, since the pandemic, it has been virtual. As I said, teachers also bring their classes to us. We use a design thinking model to plan and implement maker activities. And we do this in collaboration with the teachers on a topic of their choice so that they're making direct connections with their curricular goals. We examine various aspects of what happens during these sessions. For example, recently we did a study on how the physical environment and the materiality of the maker tools influenced or shaped the students' learning. There are a lot of different tools in a maker space. So we've done research on how students learn with and about augmented and virtual reality, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, 3D printing, vinyl cutters like Cricuts, and CNC routers. And also, quite recently, we've been doing quite a bit of research related to coding in environments such as CoSpaces, Scratch, and Minecraft. And that's been primarily because the new Ontario math curriculum now includes a coding component.
Yeah, absolutely. That all sounds amazing. So why do you think teachers should consider bringing making into the classroom? And how can making connect to those curriculum expectations?
I believe in the power of making, of being creative, and that's in support of the whole student. So physically, cognitively, and in terms of their socio-emotional development. We know from previous research that being creative can lead to reduced cognitive impairment in later life. So giving students opportunities to develop those creative passions at a really early age is very important. We also know that engaging creatively in activities enhances connectivity in the brain, and research on the psychological impacts of engaging in creating or making shows that our anxiety levels are reduced and we're happier. I know personally that making really helped me through the toughest parts of the pandemic when I was really feeling isolated and missing my friends and family. You've probably had that flow experience yourself when you're enjoying something that you're doing so much that you're entirely engaged, you're concentrating, you're present. Time often gets distorted in those experiences. And I know I sometimes forget to eat when I'm making a stained glass piece. I'm so focused on what I'm doing. And there's been quite a lot of research on the ways that making increase not only creativity and innovation skills, but also critical thinking, decision-making, and problem-solving skills. And One of the most consistent findings from my research is that engaging in making activity really promotes students to take more risks, develop stronger perseverance, and they're more engaged in their learning.
Yeah. And what about that curriculum piece? How can teachers tie making into the curriculum?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is the question that we get asked most often about by teachers is how can I integrate making in my curriculum? Sounds great, but I have all these expectations to cover. Most people associate the technologies typically found in makerspaces with STEM subjects. However, many teachers are using them in the humanities as well. In fact, I had a maker focus in my intermediate senior English class for our BEd program in this fall that just passed. I think the key is to use various tools in ways that enhance learning rather than using them for their own sake. So, for example, integrating coding with math is a natural fit in the algebra strand, but the goal is not to be producing a generation of programmers, but rather to help students look inside that black box and understand that this is a new language. At the same time, they're learning in math concepts such as patterning. When we work with teachers, we don't just show them how to use the tools. We examine pedagogical approaches that facilitate learning through making. The tools are just the vehicles to that end. These pedagogical approaches include inquiry-based and passion-based learning. So you can also think about it as how can the tools support universal design for learning? So students are learning in new ways with new tools. And they can choose to represent their learning through the use of those tools as well. We worked on a project a couple of years back with the Ministry of Education, and we worked with 20 different school districts. And part of the outputs for that project was to develop lesson plans. And so we had 60 teachers actually working on lesson plans. So we have over 200 lesson plans curated on my research website that integrate making with STEAM at the elementary level. And these are in both French and English.
Yeah. So in that research, I mean, it sounds amazing, but we know it's not without challenges. So what challenges may teachers, or have you seen teachers have in bringing making into the classroom? And what kinds of strategies and approaches would you suggest?
Yeah, lots of challenges, more rewards and successes than challenges, fortunately. But a maker approach does require a shift in pedagogical approach. So that is sometimes difficult for teachers who are used to being the expert in the room. There is a really wide spectrum of inquiry-based learning, from very teacher-directed inquiry or free or open inquiry, which is much more complex and of course requires much more flexibility. And the more freedom and the more open the inquiry, the more freedom that students have, the less teacher control there is. That's not to say that it's chaos, of course, but it's in this free and open inquiry where often the deepest learning happens. And so starting out with a more directed inquiry could help teachers ease into a maker approach, but essentially we want to get them to more free and open inquiry where possible. Another challenge is the expense. Having a makerspace is not an inexpensive endeavor. And anytime we try to shift pedagogical approaches or try to bring in technological innovation, time and material resources, money, are always big challenges when we want to implement some kind of educational change. Cost and access to materials is definitely one of the frequent issues that arises. As I said, these technologies are not cheap. Some schools have more support from parent councils or from the parent community than others. But schools don't have to buy class sets of things. In fact, I recommend that students work together on projects because that socializes the learning. Teachers can also set up stations. Some teachers call them innovation stations in the classroom and then rotate the technology So for example, the focus 1 week might be on augmented and virtual reality and how that fits into a learning module that they're working on, or 3D design the next week. And they can also use online versions. There's lots of free online apps that go with the more expensive ticket items. So for example, Tinkercad is a free web app, but the 3D printer, of course, is a really big expense. But the actual learning is in the design work, and that's free to use. It's not really in the printing of the product. And of course, the focus of a lot of the work that we do is on the process, not the product. And another challenge is that whole design process. So what technology, what materials do we need? What do we need to buy? Where can we buy them? I hear stories all the time about really expensive purchases gathering dust. So teachers need time and space to play and experiment. Sometimes there's going to be a big learning curve, and I would recommend just starting with one kind of technology, but also not being afraid of not being the expert in the room. A lot of successful teachers are those who position themselves as learners alongside their students. We actually recently just published a paper on the key characteristics of successful maker teachers, and maybe you could add a link to that.
Yeah, and definitely agree with you that there's more promises and benefits to be had from this. There inevitably will be some challenges, but easy to overcome to really get at those amazing affordances of making. So we've talked a little bit about making in general then. Let's shift. Can you tell us a bit about critical making and what that looks like?
Yeah, so key features of a critical making approach attend to the cultivation of participatory and equitable spaces where students are engaging with ideas and issues as joint seekers and co-creators of knowledge, and being producers, not just consumers of digital media. And that's an important point, because we want students to be not just consumers, but producers and also critics whenever they're using digital media. There are many affordances provided through digital media, and they offer students performative potential to assert agency, action, change, and these offer really powerful learning experiences. Understanding and more notably acting on this recognition of the remediation of both culture and learner identity really requires a pedagogical shift for many educators. A critical making approach encourages students to learn from their own active engagement with raw materials. And in the context of our research, these raw materials are additional actors in the learning process, and they include both tangible and virtual materials. A lot of the teachers we work with are interested in addressing the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and we find that that's a really good entry point for critical making, because students can select one of the goals, and then using a design thinking approach, they can try to tackle some of the issues or create solutions, even if those issues are local to their own neighborhoods or school communities. Youth have always been incredibly engaged in global issues, and even more so, or we see it more anyway. At least they can express it more easily through social media. And when we can draw on their passions, we see really deep learning naturally evolve from that. We worked with students recently, actually, on a program called Change Makers, in which we asked students to solve a real-world problem, their choice, using Internet of Things technology, IoT technologies, including microbits and Arduino and Raspberry Pi. So they conceived really amazing things, innovations, including things like a device to prevent eye strain from too much activity on screen, device to prevent texting driving, smart garden devices, and many other things as well. But what we found is that they positioned themselves as inherently capable and able to make meaningful change and have impact. So these kinds of activities can definitely promote our empowerment and agency.
Yeah, and the passion-based approach that we employed in that project not only gave students an opportunity to explore social action through making, it also centralized their student voice. So put them at the center of all of this learning, which is what making and critical making really encourages. So these students were encouraged to select a problem that they personally were passionate about, something that was relevant to them, their family, their friends, and in some cases, just society at large. Encouraging students to choose what they wanted to explore really kept them engaged in their work and passionate about designing and creating a solution to that problem. And doing so for an audience of their peers who were also working towards similar types of social action provided a supportive and authentic community for that critical making project. So that was awesome to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And that critical, or that community piece is critical.
Yeah, we've seen that in so many projects.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about it, but what other problems might critical making be best suited for?
There are so many things, in addition to the issues laid bare by the SDGs. I can give you a concrete real world example that's very recent. So some of my colleagues in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Ontario were really concerned about the shortage of high quality personal protective equipment for healthcare workers, so PPE, at the beginning of the pandemic, because obviously they were being exposed to huge viral loads of COVID. So what they did to help, so they identified a problem, right? So they used crowdsourcing to get people with 3D printers at home that were sitting idle to print face shields. And I think this is a perfect example of identifying a community need and then designing and building something to meet the need through an open source approach. So it wasn't about commercializing something for profit. It wasn't about making money off the pandemic. It was about helping and supporting others. And again, coming back to that community piece is part of what makes making critical making.
Yeah. So, how do we help teachers and learners really prioritize that human experience and that community piece during critical making then?
Well, again, the emphasis should be placed on community and empathy for others. So prioritizing why we are making something rather than how we're making it or what we're making. Making is very much a shared social practice. The tools, the technologies, they're just what we use to engage in those social practices. I'm really a huge advocate of having students work in design teams on issues and projects that they feel passionate about. And we can help them identify those passions, especially when they're not quite sure what kinds of projects they want to work on, and even develop them by getting to know them, right? Listening to them, supporting them. The teacher's role in all of this is to facilitate opportunities for students to engage in making experiences that are personally meaningful for them. We need to be cheerleaders, offering support when it's needed, but also giving them freedom to take risks and to experiment, because the learning is in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, then, because we're talking about process work, classwork is often assessed just based on the end product. So, how would you then assess or measure the success of a critical making curriculum or a critical making experience for both teachers and learners?
Yes, so that's, I said that, connecting to the curriculum was the most often asked question that we have. This is also a question that we're always asked. It's a great question. In the work that we're doing with teachers, we're focusing on the development of the global competencies. So, right, collaboration, communication, but most specifically on creativity and critical thinking, as well as citizenship. And these are the things that have been identified by so many companies in terms of the skills that they want their workers to have. And so, not just to have success at work, but also to have success in life, right? We've been using a framework that we've been working on with OECD. We were part of an international project that focused on the development of creativity and critical thinking in teacher education. There are, I think, 17 institutions across more than a dozen countries participating in this project, and the focus is on the process. So the process and the product, but as part of the process, inquiring, imagining, doing, and reflecting, those 4 key components. So for example, a level 4 for process work for creativity might include, or would include, showing a willingness to examine a variety of ideas, as well as the ability to make meaningful connections with other ideas or domains, generating several unusual or maybe even radical ideas and pushing those to their limits before making final decisions and choices, and showing awareness of the areas of personal novelty and risk that were pursued during the process, and why the final design choices were made. So we look at all of those things. On the flip side, for critical thinking, we look at things like, how well do students understand the context, the frame, or the boundaries of any given problem? How do they identify and question assumptions? How do they analyze gaps? How do they identify strengths and weaknesses of evidence or claims? How do they justify the solution or justify their reasoning on logical, ethical, or even aesthetic criteria? And how do they reflect on their own possible personal bias of their own perspective, and how does that compare to the perspectives of others? So those are the kinds of things that we're focused on right now.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Janette, for sharing your insights. This has been an incredible introduction to making and critical making. As we wrap up here, do you have any advice for teachers who want to get started with making right away?
My advice is always think big, start small, but start. Don't wait until you feel like you're an expert on a specific technology, for example. Just let your students help you figure it out. Bring it in and say, let's work on this together. This approach really takes the pressure off of you as the teacher, and it gives students autonomy that empowers them. I also recommend that teachers find a community of practice. There are many online networks, or find a teaching partner in the school where you can, somebody with whom you can bounce ideas off. And remember that there are lots and lots of resources for you online. And you can always contact us for personal learning support. Visit our website, read our new book, which is coming out in September. And I wish everybody the best of luck with their making journeys.